Martha Collins adjusted her glasses on the bridge of her nose and placed the case file on her desk. 49 years old is not the age to play give and take with the system. 23 years in the investigations division of the district attorney's office had made her one of the most respected figures in Portland law enforcement circles. 3 divorces, 2 grown children, and a reputation for never giving up. She was called Bulldog, a nickname she wore with pride. "Collins, you've got a new case." Gregory Baker, the department head, tossed a thin folder on her desk. "Real estate fraud. The guy's already in jail for something like this, but now new episodes have surfaced. We need to question him." Martha nodded without looking up. Her light brown hair, with gray streaking through it, was pulled back into a tight bun. Her ring finger bore only the mark of a wedding ring she'd taken off 5 years ago. "Jason Reed, 25 years old," she read. "Serving a 3-year sentence in Riverdale. Slippery guy," Baker said. "Gaining the trust of the elderly, convincing them to rewrite their wills. Kind of a talent." Martha closed the file and stood up. "I'll be at the prison by 2 o'clock. Riverdale Prison was a concrete box on the edge of town, surrounded by a high barbed wire fence. Martha showed her ID at the checkpoint. "Miss Collins," the young guard, Tim Reynolds, smiled. "It's good to see you." "Senior Investigator Collins," she corrected, even though she'd known him for 3 years. The interrogation room looked like any other such room. Gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 2 chairs. A window with bars, one-way glass, and a camera in the corner. The door opened and a guard ushered Jason Reed in. Martha held his gaze for a moment. He wasn't what she'd imagined him to be. Tall, with regular facial features, dark brown eyes, and short-cropped hair. A typical college boy, not a criminal. No tattoos that usually adorned Riverdale residents. In his orange prison robe, he looked out of place, as if he'd gotten here by mistake. "Have a seat, Mr. Reed." Martha pointed to a chair. Jason sat down with his hands folded in front of him. The handcuffs jingled slightly with every movement. "I'm Martha Collins, senior investigator with the district attorney's office. I have questions about the Miller-Jenkins case." "Pleased to meet you," he smiled, and Martha noted that he had a pleasant smile. "What can I do for the lawman?" Something about his tone was off. He didn't sound like a prisoner to an investigator, but like a man to a woman. Martha ignored it. "We have reason to believe that you convinced Harold and Eleanor Miller to rewrite the will in favor of a shell company." "That sounds serious?" Jason leaned forward slightly. "But what makes you think it was me?" Martha opened the folder and showed him the photograph. "Is that you and Mr. Miller?" Jason studied the picture. "It looks like me, but I don't remember that man." "Interesting." Martha pulled out more pictures. "And you don't remember these people either?" The interrogation went on for over 2 hours. Jason was calm, polite, and smiling all the time. He admitted only what was impossible to deny and denied everything else. "All right," Martha said at last. "That's enough for today. I'll be back tomorrow." "I'll be looking forward to it," Jason said, his voice again with the intonation that made Martha inwardly wary. Dr. Eliza Monroe, the prison doctor, called out to her on the way out, tall, with short blonde hair and a tired look in her eyes. "Senior Investigator Collins, can I talk to you for a minute?" They stepped aside. "I notice you're working with Reed," the doctor said. "Be careful." "What do you mean?" He's has a way with people, especially women." The doctor looked embarrassed. "A few months ago, one of the interns was suspended. She brought him books, food, passed him notes." "That won't happen to me," Martha replied with a slight smile. "Everyone says that," Monroe sighed. "Just keep in mind." The next day Martha was back, and the next day too. After a week of interrogations, she had compiled a detailed report. She was intercepted in the hallway of the prosecutor's office by a young assistant, Rebecca Hill, 28, ambitious, with impeccable references from Yale Law School. "Martha, how's the Reed case coming along?" "Slowly," Martha replied. "He's not the kind of guy who splits easily." "I could help," Rebecca offered. "I'm bored with the paperwork." "I can handle it," Martha smiled at her young colleague. "But thank you for the offer." She didn't want to admit that interrogating Jason had become more than just a job. It was a challenge, an intellectual duel. He was smart, observant, and had an amazing memory. Every conversation they had turned into an elaborate game. 2 weeks after the first interview, Martha was reviewing notes in her office when the phone rang. DCI Collins speaking. "Hello, Martha." The voice was Jason's. She straightened up. "How did you get this number?" "It doesn't matter," he said with a smile. "I wanted to continue our conversation, but not about the case. About Shakespeare. I noticed the book in your bag." Martha felt herself getting cold. No prisoner should have access to a telephone. "Mr. Reed, this is unacceptable. I will notify the prison administration of the violation." "Don't do that." His voice became serious. "I can tell you more about the Miller case, but only to you personally. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Martha hesitated. Professional duty demanded that she report, but her intuition as an investigator told her it was a chance to move the investigation forward. All right. The next day she arrived at Riverdale without an entry in the visitor's log. Security guard Reynolds, hesitant, still let her through. Years of familiarity had done their job. Jason was waiting in the interrogation room. No guards, no handcuffs. "How'd you do it?" she asked. "Everyone has their talents," he replied. "Have a seat, Martha. May I call you by your first name?" She should have said no. She should have gone out and told her superiors. Instead, she sat down across from him. "What did you want to tell me about the Miller case?" "Later," he smiled. "Shakespeare first. Are you reading Othello? Where did you—" "I saw the bookmark. A tragedy of jealousy and misguided trust. Interesting choice for an investigator." For 2 hours, they talked about literature. Martha caught herself thinking she hadn't spoken to anyone like that in years. Decades, perhaps. "You're an amazing woman, Martha," Jason said as she was about to leave. "Wise, strong. They don't make them like that these days." "Don't try to manipulate me, Mr. Reed," she said, but she couldn't hold back a slight smile. "Call me Jason." He held out his hand, and she shook it. "I'll see you next time." The next week changed everything. Martha came every day, no longer trying to justify her visits with an investigation. They talked about everything: books, travel, dreams. He talked about his childhood, a difficult one, with a drug-addicted mother and a tyrant stepfather. She about her failed marriages and disappointments. On Friday, as she was about to leave, Jason took her hand. "Do you know what's going on between us, Martha?" She did, and she was afraid of it. 49 years old versus his 25, an investigator versus a prisoner. It's all wrong. "We can't," she said quietly. "Why not?" He stepped closer. "Because some rule says so? Do you always follow the rules?" Then he kissed her, confidently, as if he had the right to do so. And Martha, against all odds, responded. Martois returned home distraught. The phone rang. The supervisor, Baker, was inquiring about the progress of Reed's case. "Everything's under control," she said, feeling her own voice betray her. That evening, she took a long look at her reflection in the mirror. A middle-aged woman with the first wrinkles, tired eyes, and unwavering principles. What was happening to her? Martha didn't go to Riverdale on Monday. She didn't go to Riverdale on Tuesday either. She avoided calls, diving headlong into other matters. Wednesday, Rebecca stopped by her office. "Martha, are you all right? You've been, different lately." "I'm fine," she replied. "I'm just tired. By the way, I've been assigned to the Riverdale surveillance team. I'll be meeting with the prisoners, checking on their conditions." Martha felt a pang of jealousy, but tried to hide it. Great experience for a young lawyer. On Thursday, Martha couldn't stand it any longer and drove to the prison. Jason waited as if he knew she was coming. "I missed you," he said. "This is a mistake," she replied. "We have to stop." "But you came." He smiled, that smile that made her heart race. "So you don't want to stop." That day, the line was crossed for good. The security cameras in this room weren't working. Martha had checked that in advance. The guard Reynolds had gotten the envelope with the money, guaranteed they wouldn't be disturbed. Everything happened quickly, greedily, as if they both knew that each encounter could be their last. Afterward, as she cleaned herself up, Martha thought she'd lost her mind. But she couldn't stop. Their secret meetings continued. Each time Martha promised herself it would be the last. Each time she came back for a new dose of attention, passion, the feeling of youth. One day, buttoning her blouse, she noticed a silhouette in the doorway. Dr. Monroe quickly looked away, but it was too late. "Eliza," Martha caught up with her in the hallway. "I can explain." "You don't have to." The prison doctor was pale. "I didn't see anything." "Thank you," Martha whispered. "I warned you," Monroe said. "He's dangerous not for what he can do, but for what he makes others do." "It's not what you think." "Are you sure?" Monroe shook her head. "You're not the first, Martha, and you won't be the last." The doctor's words haunted her all day that evening. She was reviewing Jason's file when she noticed a detail that had escaped her notice earlier. Among the medical records was a note about regular medication dispensing. The names were encrypted, but Martha recognized one code: her ex-husband had taken the same medication after a heart attack. The next morning she arrived at the office earlier than usual and called her contact in the medical database. "Frank, I need information on Reed's inmate, Jason, full medical records." "Martha, you know this is confidential. It's for a fraud case. Maybe he was faking an illness." An hour later, she got the documents she requested. What she saw made her cold. She drove to Riverdale that same day. Jason's eyes sparkled when she entered the room. "My Martha," he smiled. "I knew you'd come. Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice trembled. "About what?" He seemed genuinely surprised. "About your diagnosis. About the medication you're taking." His face changed into a mask. "You went through my medical records? That's an invasion of privacy. Answer the question, Jason." He stood up and walked to the window. "What do you want to hear, Martha? That I'm HIV positive? Yes, you are. So? So what?" She couldn't believe it. "You put me at risk." "We're adults," he shrugged. "Taking risks is part of life. You should have told me." "Would you have stayed?" He turned to her. "No, of course not. You would have run away like everyone else." Martha felt the ground go out from under her feet. "Everyone else?" she whispered. "So I'm not the only one?" Jason laughed. A cold, unpleasant laugh she'd never heard before. "Oh, Martha," he said. "Did you think you were special? At your age? Really?" She hit him, hard, flat out. It left a red mark on his cheek. "Bitch," he hissed. "Get out!" Martha ran out of the room, out of the way. She ran into Rebecca Hill in the hallway. "Martha, what's wrong?" The young woman looked anxiously at her colleague's pale face. "Nothing," Martha said. "I just don't feel well." She hadn't slept that night. Thoughts swirled in her head, forming a nightmarish kaleidoscope. Diagnosis, betrayal, risk. What now? Get tested? But if it comes back positive, her career will be ruined. Everyone will know about her affair with the prisoner. In the morning, Martha went to a private clinic in a neighboring town. 3 days later, she received a call with the results of the tests. She was standing at the window, looking out at the rain, when the nurse said the phrase that divided her life into before and after. "The result is positive, Miss Collins." Martha stood at the window, clutching the phone tightly. Raindrops beat against the glass, blurring the outline of the city. Her reflection, pale with frozen eyes, looked like a ghost. "Are you sure?" Her voice sounded alien, as if it belonged to another woman. "Unfortunately, yes," the nurse replied. "Dr. Harris would like to see you as soon as possible. We can make an appointment." "Tomorrow," Martha interrupted her. "I'll be there at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." She hung up the phone and sank slowly into the chair. The room swam around her like an image on an old movie. Positive. HIV positive. A mark you can't get rid of. A disease that couldn't be cured. Jason. She saw his smile, felt his touch. How could she be so naive? So stupid. Why hadn't she, an experienced investigator, noticed the obvious signs of manipulation? The house phone rang on the desk. The name on the caller ID was Rebecca Hill. Martha didn't answer it. A minute later, her cell phone beeped. Her boss, Baker. "Collins here." She managed to keep her tone professional. "Martha, where's the report on the Reed case? You promised it yesterday." "It'll be tomorrow morning." She closed her eyes, trying to concentrate. "I'm almost done." "Everything okay? You sound strange." "Just a little cold," she lied. "Nothing serious." After hanging up, Martha opened her laptop and started typing the report. Dry facts, legal language, no emotion. It was a distraction, an illusion of normality, as if nothing had happened, like her life wasn't falling apart before her eyes. At 8 p.m., she closed the computer and looked at her watch. Too early for sleep, too late for anything else. Time hung in a void, like herself. Martha pulled a bottle of whiskey out of the cabinet that she kept for special occasions. No glass. She took a sip straight from the neck. The alcohol burned her throat, but it didn't dull the ache inside. The evening dissolved into a haze. She turned on the television but couldn't hear the words. She tried to read, but the lines blurred before her eyes. At some point, Martha found herself in the bathroom, looking at her reflection in the mirror. Who was this woman? How could she have let this happen? The morning greeted her with a headache and nausea, partly from the whiskey, partly from the realization of reality. At 9 o'clock, she sat in the office of Dr. Harris, a full-bodied, middle-aged man with kind eyes and a graying beard. Miss Collins, first of all, I want to say that HIV infection today is not what it was 20 years ago, he said softly, but confidently. Modern antiretroviral therapy allows you to live a full life. With the right treatment, the virus can be suppressed to undetectable levels. Martha nodded, but the words passed her consciousness. The medications, the tests, the regimen, all these seemed unimportant compared to the main question, how to live on. It's important to start treatment as soon as possible, the doctor continued. I'll write you referrals for more tests and the first course of medication. When could I have been infected? Martha asked. How quickly does it show up in the tests? Antibodies are usually detected 2 to 8 weeks after infection, Harris said. In rare cases, up to 3 months. She did some quick math. Jason, it was definitely him, the only man in her life for the past year. And what are the odds of, she stammered, of transmitting the virus to another person? There is a risk with unprotected contact, but it's not 100%. The doctor looked at her more closely. Miss Collins, is there someone you should warn? No. She shook her head. I just want to understand. Leaving the clinic, Martha got into the car and looked in front of her for a long time. The rain had ended, leaving behind a washed-out, bright world that now seemed foreign to her. Her phone rang again. Baker. Collins, where are you? I need that damn report! Sent it to your email half an hour ago, she lied, knowing she could do it on the way to the office. Oh, didn't notice. Good, he said quietly. Look, are you sure you're okay? You sound a little... I'm fine, sir, she interrupted. It's just a little cold. It'll go away soon. In the office, Martha was the epitome of professionalism. No one noticed that she didn't drink coffee from a common mug, that she didn't shake hands when we met, that she avoided all physical contact. Martha! Rebecca Hill knocked on her office door. May I? A young woman came in with 2 cups of coffee. Brought you a latte, she smiled. You look exhausted. Thank you. Martha took a cup, trying not to touch her coworker's fingers. A lot of work. I was in Riverdale yesterday, Rebecca said, sitting down on the edge of the table. Talked to a few prisoners, including your Reed. He's not mine, Martha replied sharply. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Rebecca looked embarrassed. He was just asking about you. About what? When you were coming. Said you had some unfinished business. Rebecca shrugged. He's weird, kind of charming, but there's something about him wrong. Martha felt a wave of rage rising inside her. Unfinished business? After what he'd done? Forget about him, she said. He's a fraud and a manipulator. I'm done with this case. Rebecca looked at her carefully. Is something wrong, Martha? You seem a little different these days. Nothing's wrong. Martha turned away from the window. Just tired. After Rebecca left, she sat still for a long time. Anger, pain, and fear mixed into a toxic cocktail that poisoned her mind. Jason knew his status. He had intentionally put her at risk, intentionally ruined her life. That evening, Martha stood under the shower for a long time, as if the water could wash away not only the sweat and fatigue, but also the stigma of illness. Then she opened her laptop and began reading about HIV. The hours flew by. She absorbed information, statistics, people's stories. Somewhere in the back of her mind there was hope that there had been a mistake, that the second test would show a different result. The next day that hope died. The retest confirmed the diagnosis. Dr. Harris prescribed the first course of medication and made a referral to an infectious disease specialist. "Miss Collins," he said in parting, "you should consider psychological support. A diagnosis like this is a serious challenge." "I can handle it," she replied dryly. For 3 days, Martha avoided any contact other than necessary work contacts. She took documents home, citing her poor health. Phone calls were kept to a minimum. Her apartment became a fortress of protection from the outside world. On the 4th day, Baker called her in. "Collins, what's going on?" He looked at her with concern. "You're missing appointments. You're not answering your cell phone. It's not like you." "I'm sorry, sir." Martha kept a straight face, not giving away her inner storm. "A little health issue. It's under control. If you need a vacation..." "No," she shook her head. "Work is what I need right now." Baker nodded, though there was still doubt in his eyes. "Okay, but if you need anything, let me know." Back in her office, Martha found a file folder on her desk and a note from Rebecca. "Here's the stuff from Riverdale. Reed was asking about you again. Something's not right here. Shall we talk?" Martha crumpled the note. The anger she'd been trying to suppress burst out. She grabbed her car keys and walked out of the building without saying a word to anyone. The drive to Riverdale took 30 minutes. Martha didn't remember driving through them. Her mind clouded with rage. A familiar guard met her at the checkpoint. "Miss Collins," Tim Reynolds looked surprised. "We weren't expecting you today." "Urgent business," she held out her ID. "I need to see Inmate Reed, alone." Something in her gaze made the guard nod without further question. Jason was sitting in the interrogation room when she entered. His face lit up with a smile. "Martha, I knew you'd be back." He stood up, but she gestured for him to sit down. "Don't move." Her voice was icy. "I didn't come for this." The smile slowly slid off his face. "What's wrong?" he asked, though understanding flashed in his eyes. "You know what happened?" Martha put the medical report on the table. "I am HIV positive, thanks to you." Jason stared at her, unblinking. "I'm sorry about what happened," he said finally. "Sorry?" She could barely keep from screaming. "You deliberately didn't tell me your status. You knew the risks." "I'm on medication," he replied, shrugging his shoulders. "My virus has been suppressed. The risk was minimal." "The risk was..." Martha slammed her fist on the table. "You had no right to decide for me. Would you have stayed if you'd known?" His voice became harsher. "No, you'd have run away like everyone else. No one wants to be with someone like me." "That's no excuse." Martha shook her head. "What you did is a crime. What are you going to do?" He stepped forward. "Report me? Then everyone will know about us. The fact that DCI Martha Collins slept with a prisoner. Your career would be ruined." She knew he was right. Even if it could be proved he'd deliberately infected her, the price would be too high. Professional reputation, years of service, respect from colleagues. "Why, Jason?" she asked quietly. "Why did you do it?" Something changed in his face. The mask slipped away, revealing something dark, almost predatory. "Why should someone like me suffer alone?" His voice turned cold. "I contracted it from a woman who wouldn't tell me the truth. Now I'm just passing the baton on." Martha felt a chill run down her spine. "How many of us were there?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Enough," he grinned. "You're not the first, Martha, and you won't be the last." She stared at him, not recognizing the man she was close to. Where had he gone? The intelligent, sensitive conversationalist, the lover of Shakespeare and philosophical discussions. Was he real, or was it all part of an elaborate game? "You're a monster," she whispered. "No," Jason shook his head. "I'm just a product of this world. I was made this way by people like you, people who turn away from inconvenient truths, those who judge without knowing the whole picture." Martha stood up, feeling she could no longer be near him. "I will destroy you," she said. "I'll find a way. Good luck." He smiled, that charming smile that had once won her over. "But think of yourself first, Martha. About your reputation, what your co-workers will say when they find out you slept with a prisoner half your age." She walked out without looking back. Dr. Monroe caught up with her in the hallway. "Martha!" The prison doctor looked worried. I need to talk to you. They went into an empty office. I saw your last conversation with Reed, Monroe said. I didn't hear it, but I saw it. Did something happen? Martha hesitated. She couldn't trust anyone, but she desperately needed someone who understood her situation. He's not who he says he is, she said finally. I know, the doctor nodded. He's a manipulator, one of the best I've ever met. Did you know about his HIV status? Martha asked, watching the doctor's reaction carefully. Monroe sighed. Yes, he's been in therapy for 3 years. But as a doctor, I can't divulge medical information even if he's using his illness as a weapon? Martha asked sharply. The doctor looked at her carefully. What are you talking about? Martha looked away. She couldn't tell the truth. Not now. Not about anything. Forget it. Listen. Monroe put a hand on her shoulder. I don't know what exactly happened between you and Reed, but he's dangerous. Not physically, but psychologically. He knows how to find weaknesses and exploit them. Martha nodded, fighting the urge to tell everything, but something held her back: fear, shame, the realization of the irreversible. Thank you for the warning, she said, but it was too late. That evening, Martha opened a bottle of wine and sat in front of her computer for a long time, studying the laws on intentional contamination. It was a felony in most states, but proving intent was difficult. She'd need testimonials from other victims, medical records to prove Jason knew his status. At night, she had a nightmare. She was standing in front of the court, and Jason was sitting at the prosecution table, smiling his charming smile. Martha woke up in a cold sweat and couldn't sleep again. In the morning, she was awakened by a call from Baker. Collins, you're needed in the office. Urgent. An hour later, she was sitting in front of him, trying to keep a calm expression on her face. What's going on, Martha? Baker asked without preamble. You've changed your schedule. You're avoiding co-workers. You're traveling to Riverdale without being officially registered. Don't lie to me, he interrupted. Is this about the prisoner, Reed? Martha felt the blood drain from her face. What makes you think that? Guard Reynolds told Rebecca about your frequent visits. She's worried about you, so am I. Martha closed her eyes. The circle was narrowing. It's hard to explain, she said finally. Try. Baker looked at her sympathetically. Whatever happened, we can fix it. She almost told it. Almost spilled the whole story about Jason, about the diagnosis, about her fear and anger. But something held her back. Perhaps the last vestiges of professional pride. I need time, she said. Can I take a week off? Baker sighed. 2 weeks. And when you come back, I expect a full report. Leaving the office, Martha drove not home, but to Dr. Monroe's office. She found her in a small clinic near the prison. I need your help, Martha said without preamble. Were there any other women that he'd gotten close to? Monroe hesitated. I can't violate confidentiality. To hell with confidentiality, Martha raised her voice. He's using his disease as a weapon. He must be stopped. The doctor looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. There was an intern, Jessica Wilson. They got close. Then she quit suddenly. Disappeared. Do you know where to find her? I have an old address. Monroe wrote something on a piece of paper, but I'm not sure she still lives there. Martha took the address. Thank you. One more thing, Monroe added. Reed's being transferred to another prison. Tomorrow. Martha felt a chill go through her. If Jason was transferred, it would be harder to find him. Collecting evidence would be nearly impossible. She drove to the address. A small apartment on the edge of town. No one answered the phone. A neighbor said Jessica had left months ago. Pale, scared, without saying a word to anyone. Another victim. Another life ruined by Jason. Martha got back in the car and sat for a long time staring at the sunset. What now? How do you stop a man who uses his illness to take revenge on society? How to protect the other women? She didn't sleep at night. The plan formed gradually, fragment by fragment. The only way to stop Jason was to face him, one last time, before his transfer. In the morning, Martha drove to Riverdale. Tim Reynolds greeted her with surprise. Miss Collins, today's not a good day to visit. Preparations are underway for the prisoner transfers. This is important, she said, holding out an envelope. One last conversation with Reed, official business. Reynolds hesitated, but the envelope disappeared into his pocket and he nodded. 20 minutes, no more than that. Jason was waiting in the interrogation room. He looked different, focused, tense, like an animal before it leapt. Martha, his smile seemed genuine. I didn't think I'd see you again. I came to say goodbye, she said, sitting down across from him. How nice. He leaned back in his chair. So no accusations? No threats? No, Martha shook her head. I just wanted to say that despite everything, I won't give up. I'll live with it, and I'll find a way to stop you. Jason laughed. Threats don't look good on a woman of your stature, Martha, especially empty ones. It's not a threat. She leaned closer. It's a promise. Something changed in his gaze, a flicker of anxiety quickly hidden behind a mask of self-assurance. Good luck, he said, standing up. I have to go. New prison, new opportunities. Martha rose too. Her hand touched the pocket where the small object she had brought from home lay. The decision she'd come to during the night. I'll see you later, Jason, she said. I'll come visit you, very soon. The silence of the prison corridor was broken by a piercing scream. Eric Johnson, the guard on his morning rounds, stood outside cell number 216. Behind the bars, Jason Reed's body lay on the floor, motionless, eyes open, staring into the void. A makeshift tourniquet made from a torn sheet was wrapped around his neck. Code red in Sector B, Johnson shouted into the radio. Cell 216, possible suicide. 5 minutes later, the corridor was filled with people, guards, medics, the warden. Dr. Eliza Monroe knelt beside the body, checked his pulse, his pupils. He's dead, she said, rising. Presumably strangulation, but something's not right here. The warden, a heavy-set man with a military bearing, leaned toward her. What is it? The marks on her neck, Monroe said quietly, so the others wouldn't hear. They don't look like typical suicide marks. And the pupils. Strange reaction. We need an autopsy. Damn it, the warden cursed. This is just what we need. Call the police. Detective Michael Foster arrived 40 minutes later. 53 years old, graying hair, piercing blue eyes, a 20-year veteran of the police department's homicide division. He was met by the warden. It's a delicate situation, he said, leading Foster to his cell. The prisoner was to be transferred to another prison this morning. Everything was ready. Identity? Foster asked, pulling out a notebook. Jason Reed, 25 years old. Did time for fraud. Decent guy, no priors. Not the kind of guy who usually... Who found the body? Security guard Johnson, morning rounds at 6:30. The cell was cordoned off. Body was still on the floor. Photographer was taking pictures. Foster put on his gloves and squatted down next to the body. Dr. Monroe, our prison doctor. The warden pointed to a blonde woman standing off to the side. She was the first to examine the body and thinks there's something wrong here. Foster nodded. Doctor, what exactly made you suspicious? Monroe stepped closer. The marks on the neck don't match the typical self-suffocation marks. They're deeper on one side and at an odd angle, as if someone else tightened the tourniquet. Also, the pupils are more dilated than they should be for strangulation. Maybe he was under the influence of some kind of substance. Did anyone enter the cell at night? No, the warden answered. Not according to the log. What about security cameras? In this sector? The warden hesitated. There's been a technical problem. No recordings for the last 12 hours. Foster raised an eyebrow. Convenient. He turned to the guard who'd discovered the body. Tell me what you saw. Johnson, a young guy, clearly nervous, shifted from foot to foot. I was doing my usual rounds. I got to Reed's cell and saw him on the floor. The door was locked. I called for backup and only opened the cell when backup arrived. You didn't go inside until the paramedics arrived? No, sir. Protocol prohibits entering the cell alone in these situations. Foster nodded, looking around the cell. Typical prison cell. Bed, sink, toilet, small table. On the table were books, mostly classics. Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Kafka. Was he studying for a transfer? The detective asked. Are his things packed? Yes, the warden replied. His bag of personal effects is in the duty officer's office. Foster walked around the body, scrutinizing the floor, walls, furniture. then returned to the victim's neck. Really strange, he muttered. If he'd tightened the tourniquet himself, the marks would have been symmetrical. Foster turned to the medical examiner who had just entered. "What do you think, Doc?" "At first glance, asphyxiation," he replied. "But we'll need an autopsy to be sure. Time of death, tentatively between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. "All right, take the body." Foster straightened up. "I want lists of everyone who had contact with Reed in the last few days. Staff, other inmates, visitors, and logs of all movements in the sector in the last 24 hours. "Of course," the warden nodded. "You'll be assigned an office to work in." An hour later, Foster was sitting at a desk in the administrative wing of the prison, reviewing documents, visiting logs, Reed's medical records, disciplinary records, nothing unusual. A model prisoner, no enemies, no incidents. There was a knock on the door. A young woman with brown hair and a wary look entered. "Detective Foster? I'm Rebecca Hill, Assistant DA. I've been assigned to cooperate with your investigation into Reed's death." "Have a seat, Miss Hill." Foster pointed to a chair. "Did you know the deceased?" "Not personally." She shook her head. "I'd recently started working with Riverdale inmates as part of the supervision program. Saw him a few times, but I mostly know from the paperwork." "Anything unusual about his behavior lately?" Rebecca paused. "He was asking about Martha Collins, the senior investigator who was in charge of his case. Seemed interested." "In what way?" "I don't know exactly." She shrugged. "Just asking when she was coming in. Said they had some unfinished business." Foster wrote down a name. "Martha Collins. Did she visit him often?" "Not officially, no, but there were rumors that she visited unofficially. Tim Reynolds, the guard at the entrance, could tell you more." Foster raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. I'll talk to her. With Martha, complicated." Rebecca looked embarrassed. "She's on vacation, and she hasn't been herself lately. She's withdrawn, nervous." "When did this vacation start?" Yesterday. Baker, our boss, practically forced her to take a break." Foster made another note. "Thank you, Miss Hill. I'll keep you posted on the investigation." After Rebecca left, the detective went to the checkpoint where Tim Reynolds, a stocky man with a weathered face and a wary look, was on duty. "Mr. Reynolds," Foster showed his ID. "A few questions about Jason Reed." "Terrible story." The guard shook his head. "It's not like Reed. He always seemed adapted to life here. I'm told the investigator Martha Collins visited him often, unofficially." Reynolds tensed up. "I don't keep records." "I'm not from internal affairs," Foster interrupted him. "I'm only interested in the death investigation. Help me out here." The guard hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, she came in, often, usually at the end of the day when it was less crowded, always asked for the interrogation room and asked not to be logged." "How often?" "A couple times a week, for the last couple months." "When was the last time she came in?" "Yesterday," Reynolds answered. "In the evening around 6 o'clock. Said it was official business, but..." He hesitated. "Gave me an envelope, the usual." "A bribe?" "Call it what you want." The guard shrugged. "I didn't ask what their business was." "How much time did she spend with Reed?" "About half an hour. She left upset, pale, strange eyes." Foster nodded. "Did you let anyone else in to see Reed yesterday? Unofficially?" "No, just her." "And officially?" "Dr. Monroe came by this afternoon. Something about pre-transfer meds." Dr. Monroe was next on his list. He found her in the infirmary, tired but focused. "Doctor, can you tell me about Reed? Medically?" Monroe carefully closed the folder she was looking through. "Jason was HIV positive." Foster finished for her. "I'd already seen his medical records. Who knew about his diagnosis?" "That's confidential information," she answered cautiously. "Only the nursing staff and the patient. By law, we can't divulge." "But he could have told you." "Theoretically, yes. But Jason was very secretive about his status." "Was he also secretive with women?" Foster asked bluntly. Monroe flinched. "What do you mean?" "I'm told Reed had a special connection with some women. A trainee, Investigator Collins. Did he tell them about his diagnosis?" The doctor looked at him for a long time, as if weighing up what to say. "I don't know about the intern, and with Investigator Collins," she sighed. "I shouldn't say this, but since he's dead and you're investigating a murder..." I saw them talking yesterday. I couldn't hear what they were talking about, but it was clearly about his diagnosis. Martha looked furious. Did you talk to her afterward? Yes, Monroe looked away. She didn't say it directly, but I think Reed didn't warn her about his status, and she got infected. Foster felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together. Are you sure? No, the doctor shook her head. That's my guess, but she was asking about other women that Reed might have get close to. There was an intern, Jessica Wilson. She suddenly disappeared a few months ago. Do you know where to find her? I gave Martha the old address, but I doubt Jessica still lives there. Foster went back to his office and called his partner, Detective Rodriguez. Check everything you can on Martha Collins, he said, and find her, now. By late afternoon, the picture began to clear. The medical examiner confirmed that Reed's death was not a suicide. There was a strong sedative in the blood, and the marks on his neck indicated strangulation from behind. Detective? Rebecca entered the office with a small book in her hands. I found this among Reed's things. It looks like a diary. There are entries about Martha and, other women. Foster opened the book. Small, neat handwriting filled the pages. Names, dates, notes of some kind. MK is proud, strong, lonely. Perfect target. First contact, September 16th. He read aloud. It looked like a hunting diary. Rebecca nodded. There are places in there where he writes explicitly about his diagnosis and how he's not going to warn women. Some kind of revenge on society. Foster flipped through the pages. The cold, calculating writings of a psychopath methodically destroying women's lives. That gives Martha a strong motive for murder. You really think she could have killed him? Rebecca looked shocked. Under these circumstances? Yes, quite possibly. Soon Rodriguez showed up with more information. Martha Collins was indeed tested for HIV 2 weeks ago. It came back positive. Also, the security guard on duty overnight in Sector B admitted to letting a woman who looked like Collins in at around 1 a.m. She showed her ID and said she had an urgent conversation with an inmate before transfer. Did he let her into her cell? No, just the sector. Said she opened the cell herself. She had a key. And the sedative? Where'd it come from? A bottle of strong sedative went missing from the prison pharmacy. It went unnoticed because someone switched the contents. Water inside. Only the nurses and Dr. Monroe had access. Foster thought for a moment. The picture was coming together more and more clearly. Rebecca, talk to Dr. Monroe again. I think she knows more than she's letting on. Rebecca returned an hour later, pale and shaken. Dr. Monroe confessed to helping Martha break into Reed's cell that night. Why? Because Reed had deliberately infected not only Martha, but Monroe herself. They had a brief affair a year ago. He didn't tell her his status. She found out about the diagnosis later during a routine checkup. When Martha came to her with the same story, they decided to stop him, before he did it to the other women after the transfer. Where's Martha now? Monroe said she was headed to a cabin on the coast. Monroe's family has property there. Here's the address. Foster took the note. Put a bolo out on her, but keep it quiet. I'll go there myself. I'll talk to her first. The cabin was a small wooden shack on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Martha's car was parked out front. Foster walked slowly to the door and knocked. Martha Collins? Detective Michael Foster, police. We need to talk. Silence. Then slow footsteps. The door opened, and he saw the pale face of a woman who looked older than her years. You found me, she said without surprise. Come in. Inside was clean and neat. On the desk was a laptop and a stack of papers. By the window was a chair overlooking the ocean. Dr. Monroe told you? Martha asked, sitting down in the chair. Yes, Foster remained standing. She confessed her complicity. Martha nodded. I told her I'd take the blame. She only helped me get in. I did the rest. Tell me what happened. Martha stared out the window for a long time, then began to speak, quietly, monotonously, as if she were reading an account of someone else's life. I was infected by him. He knew his status and deliberately put me at risk. When I found out he was being transferred where there would be new victims, I knew I had to stop him. So you decided to kill him? I decided to bring justice. Her voice remained calm. The system wouldn't protect other women. If I had filed a complaint, it would have ruined my career. and he might not even have been convicted. He would have gone on to ruin lives. How did you do it? The sedative was from Elise. She also helped me get into the sector. I had a duplicate key to his cell, made an imprint of it a few weeks ago. So what happened next? I entered the cell. He was asleep. I put sedative in the water, woke him up, made him drink. When he got weak, I used a tourniquet made from a sheet. It took less than 5 minutes. Foster was silent, watching her. The woman who had killed the man looked completely calm, almost detached. Are you remorseful? No, she answered simply. I protected other women from his crimes. If the system had worked properly, I wouldn't have had to do it. You broke the law, Martha. Murder is... I know what I did, she interrupted him, and I'm prepared to be punished. But first I want you to read this. She handed him a stack of papers from her desk. Here are the names of the other women Reed infected. I found 8, including me and Elise. Jessica Wilson committed suicide after her diagnosis. All of this information needs to be made public. People need to know what happened. Foster took the papers. I can't promise that this will commute the sentence. I'm not asking for leniency, Martha replied. I'm asking for the truth. Justice for all the women whose lives he ruined. The detective nodded. You are under arrest on suspicion of Jason Reed's murder, he said in an official tone. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Martha stood up, allowing herself to be handcuffed. Her face remained calm, almost peaceful. I know my rights, detective, she said. I've defended the rights of others. On the drive back to the city, clouds gathered over the ocean. Foster drove in silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at his arrestee. Martha stared out the window, as if trying to memorize every detail of the passing landscape. Have you ever been in a situation where the system can't protect the innocent, detective? She asked suddenly. Foster hesitated to answer. I have, he finally admitted. But I've never taken the law into my own hands, even when it might have saved lives? Even then, he answered firmly. That's the difference between justice and revenge. Martha smiled, for the first time in a while. Perhaps you're right, but I don't regret my choice. Every decision has its price, and I'm willing to pay mine. They drove into town as the rain began to fall. The droplets pounded on the roof of the car, creating a monotonous rhythm similar to a heartbeat. Foster couldn't help but think about how thin the line was between justice and crime, between protecting the innocent and revenge. Martha had crossed that line, but had she been completely wrong? That question would probably haunt him for a long time to come. At the police station, Rebecca Hill was waiting for them. When she saw Martha in handcuffs, she turned pale. Martha, she began, but stopped talking, not knowing what to say. It's all right, Rebecca, Collins replied calmly. I did what I thought was right. Foster handed the arrestee over to the other officers for processing and took Rebecca aside. She confessed, he said quietly, completely, and she seems pretty sure she's right. What will happen to her? That's for the court to decide, but given the circumstances and her sterling reputation before... He shrugged. In any case, the story's not over. These documents, he showed the folder Martha had given him, could lead to a revision of the defense against the deliberate spread of infections. Rebecca nodded, looking at Martha as she walked away. You know what the worst part is? She said quietly. I'm not sure what I would have done differently if I were her. Foster didn't answer. That was the crux of the problem. He wasn't sure either. The system he'd served all his life sometimes failed, and then people took justice into their own hands, turning from victims to perpetrators. The day was ending, and the rain was getting heavier. Foster stood at the window, watching the water wash the mud off the streets. He thought of Martha, of Jason, of all the women whose lives had been mangled by this story, about the justice that sometimes comes too late or at too high a cost. Justice and crime. Sometimes the line between the two is blurrier than those who uphold the law would like to admit.